I'll be reading Psalm 133. How very good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity. It is like the precious oil on the head, running down upon the beard of Aaron, running down over the collar of his robes. It's like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord ordained his blessing, life forevermore.
I wonder how many of you have travel plans this summer that involve extended family, either a family reunion or going on vacation together with extended family. How many of you are planning to see extended family over the summer? Okay. I would recommend not raising your hand for this next question, but you can if you want to. I wonder how many of you, as you anticipate that, feel something ranging from anxiety to dread. Again, don't raise your hands, but I imagine that is a non-zero number for us. Some of us, when we look ahead to gathering with family, we see that it's charged with potential. There's all of this potential for it to be a wonderful, life-giving, energizing, relaxing time where we build lifelong memories and deepen connections with our extended family. And it also is charged with the potential that things could go catastrophically wrong. As we think about that potential, the potential for things to go wrong, maybe we could borrow a typology from Donald Rumsfeld. We could say that when we get together with extended family, there are the known knowns of things that could go wrong. Maybe you have someone in your family who has deeply held political opinions that are out of sync with the rest of the family. Or someone who has a very specific dietary regimen that they try to follow that makes it really hard to feed everybody together. But you know about this in advance, you can sort of make your plan to mitigate it. When Uncle so-and-so starts talking politics, we're all just gonna leave the room and go over here, or everyone's gonna bring their own food and we're not even gonna try to do meals together. You have ways you can mitigate it. But then there are what Rumsfeld would have called the known unknowns. Those things that you expect could go weird, but you're not sure exactly how they might go sideways. Like the Airbnb claims that it sleeps 14, but it did not tell you that 3 of those are in hammocks over the toilet. And so now you're in the moment and you gotta figure it out and make it work. But then you have what Rumsfeld called the unknown unknowns, the things you don't even know to plan for. Bad weather happens, or a vehicle breaks down, or you forget how to drive for a little while, the GPS stops working, or someone gets an injury. There are all of these things that can go wrong unexpectedly that you can't even really plan for in advance, but responding to is made more complicated by the fact that instead of being a family of 4 or 5 on vacation, you're a group of 15, and everybody's got an opinion about what you should do. It can be kind of stressful to travel together as an extended family. I invite you to keep that in mind as we reflect on this psalm that Nina read for us. Psalm 133 is one of a collection of psalms contained within the Psalter that are called the Songs of Ascent. And scholarship suggests that these psalms originated out of the Jewish experience of pilgrimage. Judaism was, for a very long time, a pilgrimage religion, where at least 3 times a year, every faithful Jew was expected to travel with their family from wherever they had settled, wherever they were living and farming and raising their family. They were expected to travel together to Jerusalem to worship together. And they came up with this collection of songs that seems likely that they would have been sung together, almost like a sea shanty. As we are traveling together, we are going to sing these songs. And one of these songs that they were instructed to sing is this song about the blessedness of unity. How very good and pleasant it is when kindred or kinfolk live together in unity. It's optimistic. It looks forward to the positive potential of what is, in essence, a very large extended family reunion. The nation of Israel descends from 12 tribes. At some level, they all thought of themselves as relatives of one another. And here they were making this pilgrimage, taking this massive extended family vacation, celebrating the promise and potential of dwelling together in unity. But there's this shadow side embedded within the psalm. Here's the way the Old Testament scholar John Goldingay puts it. He says, unity is something for which families would hope when they gathered for pilgrimage. But even enunciating the point reflects, whether wittingly or unwittingly, a realistic awareness that such gatherings could generate all manner of conflict. Simmering family tensions would have plenty of opportunity to receive expression. So they're invited to sing this song, this optimistic song, looking forward to dwelling together in unity. Well, they may have been experiencing very real conflict along the way. And I think the same is true of us when we gather together for worship. Unity is something we might hope for, orient ourselves for, but it's not necessarily something that is guaranteed. The very act of trying to come together in worship has the potential to actually drive us further apart from each other. We experience some similar dynamics. Now, we have huge advantages over the ancients, the most notable of which, especially on a day like today, is central air conditioning. We sit here and our physical bodies are very, very comfortable. We have septic systems and abundant, clean running water. We have all of these advantages when it comes to the material conditions in which we engage together in worship. We have a leg up on the ancients. It's easier for us to dwell together in unity because we're much more comfortable than they were. But we have one notable disadvantage, which is that when they would gather together, when they would reach the end of this pilgrimage and come into Jerusalem together to worship together, when that would happen, they all knew exactly what it was they were supposed to do. They were supposed to say these words in this order. They were supposed to slaughter these animals in this order. They were supposed to eat these foods, especially at the Passover, in this very prescribed order. It was clear what we were supposed to do together that would constitute our shared worship. So the journey, the pilgrimage, could have been much more difficult than what we experienced trying to get here on a Sunday morning. But they knew exactly what worship was supposed to be once they got there. Whereas I would suggest that we actually have a much harder task of finding this unity, this goodness and pleasantness that happens when kinfolk live together in unity, because we don't all necessarily agree on what worship should be. Maybe at the broadest level, the broadest strokes outline, we say, well, we worship in a Christian manner, which I certainly hope remains true of us. But to say we worship in a Christian manner, that is a very, very broad definition. There are all sorts of things that have passed for Christian worship that we might find more or less comfortable. Or we might get more specific than that, where we might say we worship in an Anabaptist manner or a Mennonite manner. And that might mean something to us today, but my suspicion is that whatever we would point to that makes our Anabaptist worship Anabaptist has been rejected or at least contested by some Anabaptist at some point in history. Part of what defines the Anabaptist tradition is ongoing disagreements about what worship ought to be. Even something as basic or seemingly basic as singing. I think many of us would say, well, the thing that makes a Mennonite worship service Mennonite is 4-part singing. But some of the earliest Anabaptists did not seem to be very big fans of singing. Conrad Grebel, one of the earliest leaders of the Anabaptist movement, tried to institute a blanket prohibition on singing in worship services. This is what he said. He said, whatever we are not taught by clear passages or examples in Scripture must be regarded as forbidden. If the New Testament doesn't clearly command it, we must say it's forbidden, just as if it were written, this do not, sing not. Then he goes on to say, whoever sings poorly gets vexation by it. That's me, I get vexation by it. Whoever can sing well gets conceit. So Grebel did not think that Mennonites should ever sing. We weren't called Mennonites yet, they were just Anabaptists. This new movement, Grebel did not think that singing should characterize the worship service of this newly emerging branch of the Christian faith. And I just want to pause there. Imagine if I stood up here one Sunday. I was like, listen, folks, I can't find it in the New Testament. I don't think we should sing together anymore in worship. My children would be eating cup noodles for months because I just wouldn't have a job anymore. Like, it is so part and parcel of our identity and who we are. But it's not universal within the Anabaptist tradition. And so we have to do the continual work of figuring out what is it that allows us to dwell together and to worship together in unity. And we're deeply skeptical of authority. We can't even, in those ongoing disagreements that we have with one another, we can't even appeal to an authority and say, well, this liturgical commission said we should do it this way, or this hymnal said we should do it this way, and that's the right thing. Even appealing to tradition, which many of us would want to do, if we're really honest, the one constant in the tradition is change. Disagreement, trying to figure it out together. Over the past decade or so, Mennonite Church USA, primarily Menno Media, Mennonite Church Canada, have been working to develop an updated hymnal after the 1992 hymnal. And I came across recently a really fascinating essay written by one of the editors of that hymnal. She was the editor of the Collection of Worship Resources. And she tells this story that an early draft of the hymnal, of the worship resources part of the hymnal, contains some ideas or guidance for communion. And it talked about the fact that different communities will find it meaningful to practice communion in different ways. Things like whether you have intinction or whether you have a common cup, whether you come forward or whether the elements are passed out, whether you sit at a table together. It lists all of these different ways that communities might celebrate communion together. And then the early draft included this phrase: although there are a variety of options, communities are encouraged to discern a consistent local practice. So there are all sorts of different ways of celebrating communion, but whatever fits in your community, you should try to make it consistent. And this draft got sent out to reviewers, and an early reviewer said this: the statement about encouraging a consistent local practice feels uncomfortable to me, somewhat authoritarian. Plus, I don't know that I would agree with it. I would prefer a softer approach. So even a centralized expectation, not to tell you this is how you should do communion, but however you choose to do communion, make it consistent. Someone said, no, that's authoritarian, which I would really love to introduce that person to actual authoritarianism so they can get a feel for what it actually is like. We have these strong differences of opinion, no central authority to which we can appeal, and yet there is this promise held before us that it is good and pleasant when kinfolk live and worship together in unity. And you could say it's kind of like an extended family vacation, gathering together for worship. We have the known knowns, the things that we already know that we disagree about, our stylistic preferences in worship. Some people prefer a cappella, 4-part singing. Some people prefer very contemporary music. Some people like bluegrass. We know that we have these differences of opinion. And then we have what we might call the known unknowns. I would imagine that our preferences around the sort of gendered language we use for God, whether we refer to God as Father, that if we really were to press into that issue, we would discover some strong differences of opinion. So we know that there's some unknown there. I don't know what sort of the median preference of this congregation is, but I know there would probably be some differences. And then we still have these unknown unknowns, the things about worship that will unsettle some of us that we don't even know about. I can give you an example from the relatively recent past. I did not know that the location of the piano, whether it sat on the floor or sat on the platform, would be a matter of conversation, sustained conversation, perhaps even sustained disagreement. It was completely unknown to me. I was like, I don't think anybody cares that much. And then I learned that, no, actually, it is kind of a big deal. It reflects what we think about our communal values, about a certain egalitarian approach to worship, performance versus participation. It touched on all of these things that I had no idea would be in the mix. So how then do we move toward the experience of unity that I think we all desire, that seems to hold forth the promise or potential of blessing? How do we move toward that unity as a community whose tradition is strong and ongoing and sustained disagreement about what worship ought to be? I want to offer 2 suggestions for us, one coming from this psalm and one I think drawn more from the example of Jesus and the early church, that might help us move toward greater unity, not uniformity, not that we all agree about everything, but in the midst of coming together as kinfolk, as an extended spiritual family, coming together in a sort of pilgrimage to move toward this living in unity that is good and is pleasant. First thing I invite us to think about is our mentality. And the mentality I have in mind is specifically the mentality of scarcity or abundance. This is a framework that Walter Brueggemann has worked with extensively in trying to understand the Old Testament. Javen preached about it back on Thanksgiving. I'm going to come back to this theme after we're through this series on worship. But part of what's going on in this pilgrimage experience of the children of Israel, part of what's going on is the very real experience of scarcity. John Goldengay puts it this way. He says, competition for scarce resources, such as places to stay and supplies of water, would encourage tensions between different groups. We've experienced this on our own vacations, right? If you've ever tried to go to a tourist hotspot, you know that there is a scarcity, right? There are only so many tickets to the amusement park, so many parking places, so many bottles of water. We know what it's like to be traveling somewhere and to experience scarcity. And the ancients would have experienced that almost to infinity because they did not have the sorts of creature comforts that we take for granted. And so the possibility of not experiencing unity would have very much driven the potential for tension. Where am I going to pitch my tent? Is there enough water there? Is there enough food to eat? Right? And so they would have felt that they were somehow in competition with one another to ensure that their needs were met, even if it came at the expense of their kinfolk. But what the psalm points toward is this superabundance. What they would have been encouraged to sing as they were experiencing this very real material scarcity is this image of superabundance. It's like precious oil on the head, running down the beard, running over the collar of his robes. This is not an image, I don't think, of just a normal anointing service. This is of superabundance. That because God, in the language of another psalm, owns cattle on 1,000 hills, we don't have to always think of ourselves in competition with one another for scarce resources. God has created a world of abundance. God has created a world that is designed to meet every need that we have, if we can find ways to collaborate, to share our resources, to not take more than we need. So this psalm points toward superabundance. It's like the dew of Hermon, which is a different mountain. We're falling on Mount Zion. There is so much abundance in God's world that even the normal natural order of things, the dew that falls here stays here, right? Even that is somehow upset or transformed. This dew and all of its abundance, that rich supply of water, it can come over here. God is able to, through our participation, see that there is this world of abundance. And so in our worship services, do we approach this experience as one of scarcity? We have 52 hours a year to gather together for worship, and I really want to make sure that we hear these 7 hymns during those 52 hours. Or do we approach it as a time of abundance? What we are doing here in gathered worship is a foretaste, an anticipation of what we will literally do for all of eternity. There is more than enough time and opportunity of worship to go around, which means that my needs, my preferences, don't always have to be front and center. There is more than enough for everyone, if we choose to enter into God's abundance through unity. For there the Lord ordained his blessing, life forevermore. It's interesting to think about, what does this there refer to? What is the antecedent of that? Is it talking about Zion? Maybe, because they're making this pilgrimage into the holy city. Or is it talking about this place, this experiential place of unity, where kinfolk dwell together in unity? Is that the place where God ordains a blessing, life forevermore, eternal life? Is it possible that by choosing to have a mentality of abundance and move toward unity together, we will actually experience more than we might naturally experience if we were just trying to grab everything for ourselves? And so closely connected with this mentality, whether it's a mentality of scarcity or one of abundance, is the practice of humility. And this is where we move outside the scope of just this psalm into the example of Jesus and the early church. If someone were to ask me what was distinctive about the early Christian communities relative to their Greco-Roman neighbors, I think humility would be probably in the top 5 things that I would point to. That because of the example of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, and the practice of the early church, humility began to be regarded as a virtue, something good that we should aspire toward. In a culture that was very concerned with honor and status, and felt that honor and status could be gained primarily at the expense of others, there was this group of people who began to, in the language of Philippians, to esteem others as higher than themselves. They began to practice humility. And so I wonder what it would look like to bring this posture of humility into our ongoing work of shaping our corporate worship services. I don't know if you ever heard the analogy that the people at the party who took 3 pieces of pizza and the people at the party who took 1 piece of pizza both shared the same fundamental assumption: there's not enough pizza to go around. And some people, when faced with a perceived reality of scarcity, say, I need to make sure I get enough for myself. And others say, I need to make sure that there is enough for others. When you're hungry, you're hungry. If you're buying pizza for people, make sure you just buy a superabundance of pizza. Just buy all of the pizza if you can. Hopefully we don't find ourselves in that situation. But if we do, I believe followers of Jesus are called to be 1 piece of pizza kind of people. People who look to the needs of others even before we look to our own needs. People who esteem others as better than ourselves. It's moving into an experience of abundance, even if the prevailing evidence seems to point in the other direction. I'm counting the pizza, I'm counting the people, the math is not quite adding up. But what you find is that if everyone holds back just a little bit, all of a sudden there is enough. There is enough for everyone to eat their fill. There is enough because God commands a blessing, in the language of the psalm, in spaces of unity. So when we gather together in worship, this space is charged with potential. Just like an extended family vacation or a pilgrimage to Zion, it is charged with the potential for truly life-changing experiences of renewal and restoration, of refreshing, of deepening connection with others. It is charged with that potential. And it also carries the very real risk of pain, unkind words, unmet expectations. Both of those exist side by side when we come together in worship. But it is good and it is pleasant when kinfolk live together in unity. And as we move toward that unity, we discover this superabundance of God's goodness and grace, the blessing of life forevermore. John Goldingay, in reflecting on this psalm, he looks ahead to the words of Jesus in John 17, and what he describes as the most spectacularly unanswered prayer in world history. Jesus' prayer that Christians would be one, even as Jesus and the Father are one. And Goldingay says, Christian kinfolk live in breathtaking disharmony. This devastates their witness as it removes the goodness and the loveliness from them. It removes their joy and surrenders their blessing. But the psalm invites us to consider the loveliness of kinfolk living as one, and to meditate on the images for this that it offers, to see if this can inspire us to live as one. To look to this world of abundance that God has created, to see that there is more than enough for everyone, that not every worship service can meet every one of my personal preferences, but over time there is enough for all of us. We can dwell in unity and discover that it's good and it's pleasant, to find God's blessing of life forevermore. So this morning we're going to move into a time of communion, a celebration of Christian unity, one of the few constants that runs throughout almost every Christian tradition, I think with the exception of Quakers, of coming together in the way that Jesus instructed his disciples, that Paul instructed the church in Corinth, to partake of bread and wine, in this case it's actually juice, to partake of that together as one body. In the language of the old Anabaptists, just as every grain sort of gave of its life to become this one bread, so each of us gives of ourselves and we become one body. And so the question of preparation I would put before you is, as you look around this sanctuary, as you think about the people that you worship with, these kinfolk of your spiritual family who have gathered together, do you see your neighbors in this church as a source of competition for scarce resources? Or as the very means of abundance through which God might meet all of our needs? Each of us coming together with a mentality of abundance and a posture of humility, bringing our preferences and desires and thoughts into this gathered worship, doing the work of discerning together who we are and who we're called to be, and seeing that through our neighbors we discover the very promise of God. So I'd invite our communion servers to come forward. Communion here at Forest Hills is open to anyone who's been baptized in the name of Jesus. You don't have to be a member of this church, but if you've been baptized, you're welcome to this table. If you haven't yet been baptized but want to participate in this service, Nina's available to offer a prayer of blessing for you. The ushers will be coming forward to dismiss you by row. We'll be practicing intinction, so you'll take a piece of bread, dip it into the juice, and then partake of it. And as the servers prepare these elements, I would remind us that Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed, gathered his disciples together for a meal. And Jesus took bread, and after he had given thanks for it, he broke it and he offered it to his disciples, saying, "This is my body broken for you." And in the same way, Jesus took the cup, and after he had given thanks for it, he offered it to his disciples, saying, "This is my blood shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins." I invite each of you to come and partake of the abundant gifts of God for the people of God.